They told us segregation was over. They took down the signs, rewrote the laws, and promised a new era of equality. But what if the most powerful parts of Jim Crow never vanished at all? What if they simply learned to hide in plain sight? Today, discrimination rarely announces itself. It doesn't need to. Instead of openly racial laws, we are given race-neutral language, local control, nearby, colorblind policy, market forces, public safety. These words sound fair. They sound reasonable. But behind them, the outcomes look hauntingly familiar. Neighborhoods remain divided. Schools are funded unequally. Voting power is quietly diluted. Policing falls hardest on the same communities, generation after generation. This isn't about the past refusing to stay buried. It's about how legal systems evolve. When one door closes, another opens. When explicit exclusion becomes illegal, structural exclusion becomes policy. The rules no longer mention race, yet race still predicts who gets opportunity, who gets representation, and who faces the harshest consequences of the law. In this deep dive, we're not chasing outrage, we're tracing logic. We're following court rulings, policy language, and legal precedents that appear neutral on paper but create deeply unequal realities in practice. From housing lines drawn decades ago to school funding formulas, from voting maps to everyday police encounters, the question isn't whether discrimination exists, it's how it survives without ever saying its name. If you've ever wondered why inequality feels persistent no matter how many reforms pass, this story matters, because understanding the system is the first step toward challenging it. If content like this matters to youstries that connect history, law, and real life, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Here, we don't just tell history, we uncover how it's still shaping the present. Once the language of segregation disappeared from the law, the system did not abandon its objectives, it refined its methods. If race could no longer be named, it could still be managed. And one of the clearest examples of this transformation appears in a place most people never think to look: the census count, the quiet arithmetic that decides who holds political power. Imagine a man taken from his neighborhood, arrested, convicted, and sent hundreds of miles away to a rural prison. His family remains in the city. His community loses his labor, his presence, his voice. But on paper, the state performs a strange maneuver. When political districts are redrawn, that man is no longer counted where he lived, voted, paid taxes, and built relationships. Instead, he is counted as a resident of the rural district where the prison sits, even though he cannot vote there, run for office there, or influence any local decision. His body is present, but his citizenship is not. This is prison gerrymandering, and it fits seamlessly into the larger pattern already unfolding in this story. Just as local control preserves school inequality and colorblind policy protects segregated housing, this practice quietly reshapes democracy without ever invoking race. The outcome, however, follows a familiar script. Urban communities disproportionately black and already underrepresented low population on paper and therefore lose political weight. Rural districts, often whiter and more politically powerful, gain representation built on people who have no voice at all. This logic is not new. After Reconstruction, when black men briefly exercised political power, Southern states responded with a calculated strategy. They used criminal laws, often vague and selectively enforced, to arrest black citizens in large numbers. Voting rights were stripped away through felony disenfranchisement, yet those same individuals were still counted for representation, boosting the political strength of white-controlled districts. The law did not need to announce its purpose. Its design spoke for itself. Today's version is more polished, wrapped in administrative language, and defended as a technical necessity. Officials claim prisoners must be counted where they are physically located, as if geography alone determines representation. But representation has never been about physical presence. It is about political agency. Counting people where they cannot participate transforms them into political currency, a resource transferred from one community to another without consent. The consequences ripple outward. when a district's political influence depends on a large incarcerated population, there is little incentive to reduce incarceration. Policies that might shorten sentences, expand alternatives, commissioned class isism, or address root causes suddenly threaten political power. Meanwhile, the neighborhoods most affected by policing and imprisonment find themselves weakened at every turn, losing not only residents, but the representation needed to challenge the very systems harming them. This is how the story connects back to everything that came before. Segregation today does not rely on visible barriers. It operates through systems that appear neutral while reinforcing the same hierarchies. Voting maps, like school funding formulas and housing policies, become tools that quietly decide whose voices matter most. The law insists it is fair because it does not mention race, even as its outcomes align perfectly with racial lines drawn decades earlier. Prison gerrymandering shows how democracy can be reshaped without altering a single constitutional principle. No vote is explicitly denied in the moment of redistricting. No racial category is invoked. And yet, entire communities are diluted, their political influence siphoned away through a mechanism few people ever see. It is segregation without signs, exclusion without slurs, power redistributed through spreadsheets rather than speeches. When we connect this practice to the broader legal landscape, the pattern becomes undeniable. Control, representation, and you control policy. Control policy. And you control opportunity. The system no longer needs to announce who belongs and who does not. It simply counts and decides accordingly. Once political power is quietly shifted through counting and district lines, the system turns to a more intimate arena, one where the consequences are immediate and personal. The courtroom. If prison gerrymandering decides who speaks for a community, jury selection decides who is believed, who is protected, and who is punished. And just like the policies that came before it, the modern process insists it is fair, neutral, and blind, even as its outcomes tell a different story. Juries are supposed to be the democratic heart of the justice system. Ordinary citizens, drawn from the community, standing between the individual and the full force of the state. In theory, this is where equality is meant to be undeniable, where the law meets lived experience and balances itself. But theory has always been easier than practice. As overt racial exclusion became illegal, the system adapted, replacing open barriers with discretion so broad it might as well be invisible. Today, prosecutors no longer say they are removing a juror because of race. They don't have to. Instead, they rely on explanations that sound neutral and harmless on the surface. A juror seemed inattentive, hesitated when asked about punishment, knew someone connected to the case, or simply didn't feel right. Each reason stands alone as plausible. Together, they form a pattern that has reshaped courtrooms across the country. This evolution mirrors everything we've already seen. Just as voting power is diluted without mentioning race, and communities are segregated without explicit lines, jury pools are engineered through language that avoids scrutiny. The law technically forbids discrimination, but it places the burden not on outcomes, but on intent. As long as the stated reason does not openly reference race, the removal stands. The result is a system that rewards creativity rather than fairness, encouraging justifications that sound objective while achieving familiar ends. The impact is profound. When juries no longer reflect the communities they judge, verdicts begin to tilt in predictable ways. Life experiences vanish from the room. Context is stripped away. The legal process becomes narrower, colder, and more detached from the realities it claims to evaluate. For defendants, so, especially those from marginalized communities, this imbalance can turn a trial into a formality rather than a genuine search for truth. This is not an accident or a flaw in an otherwise neutral system. It is a continuation of a long legal tradition. Under earlier systems of segregation, exclusion from juries was explicit and unapologetic. The law announced who was qualified to judge and who was not. Today, the same outcome is achieved through process rather than proclamation. The door is technically open, but the rules of entry are quietly adjusted. What makes this especially powerful is how difficult it is to challenge. Courts rarely question the explanations given for juror removal. They are treated as matters of intuition, strategy, and professional judgment, areas where scrutiny is discouraged. Over time, this has trained legal actors to speak a shared language, one that signals exclusion without naming it. The system learns. The methods improve. The appearance of fairness remains intact. And this, again, connects back to the larger structure. Representation is first weakened in legislatures, then filtered through policing, and finally reshaped in courtrooms. Each stage reinforces the next. By the time a case reaches trial, the groundwork has already been laid. Who is stopped? Who is charged? Who is counted? And who is heard all follow the same underlying logic. Jury selection becomes the final refinement, the moment where neutrality is performed most convincingly. 12 seats, a formal process, polite questions, and carefully chosen words. Yet behind that formality lies a mechanism as old as the system itself. Control who decides, and you control the outcome. The modern courtroom does not announce bias, it denies it. And in that denial, it preserves it, not through hostility, but through procedure, not through exclusion, but through explanation. What emerges is a justice system that can claim equality while consistently delivering imbalance, one verdict at a time. By the time power has been reshaped in legislatures and juries, the system still needs an entry point, a place where ordinary life can be quietly redirected into the machinery of punishment. That entry point is the traffic stop. It appears mundane, even trivial, yet it is one of the most powerful legal tools ever created, not because it announces authority, but because it disguises it as routine. On the surface, traffic laws exist to keep roads safe. In practice, they form a web so dense that nearly every driver violates one without realizing it. A tail light slightly dimmer than required, a turn made a little too wide, a pause at a stop sign judged a second too short. These details seem insignificant, but they carry enormous legal weight. Once a stop is justified, an entire sequence of authority unfolds, all sanctioned by law and shielded from deeper scrutiny. This is where the pattern we have been tracing tightens. Just as representation can be shifted without redrawing explicit racial lines, policing can be targeted without naming race at all. Officers do not need to say who they are watching. Patrol patterns, neighborhood focus, and enforcement priorities do the work for them. Certain areas are saturated with stops, while others are barely touched. The result is not random, even if it is defended as neutral. For many drivers, a traffic stop is an inconvenience. For others, it is a moment of risk. What begins as a minor infraction can quickly expand into questioning, searches, and records that follow a person long after the flashing lights disappear. Court fees pile up. Missed payments lead to suspended licenses. Driving out of necessity then becomes another violation. Step by step, an ordinary act of mobility turns into a pathway toward criminalization. This escalation mirrors everything that came before it. The system does not need sweeping accusations or dramatic arrests. It relies on accumulation. Each stop adds a data point. Each citation builds a file. Over time, patterns form, and those patterns justify further attention. A community already weakened by diluted political power and underrepresented juries now finds itself overrepresented in police databases and court dockets. Historically, this logic is familiar. Earlier systems used broad, vague laws to justify constant surveillance and control, claiming public order while enforcing social boundaries. Today's traffic code serves a similar function, offering endless justifications that appear objective while granting enormous discretion. The law insists that intent does not matter as long as a rule was technically broken. That principle creates a shield so strong that motivation becomes irrelevant. What makes this especially powerful is how normal it feels. Traffic stops are woven into daily life, accepted as a necessary part of modern society. That normalcy masks their cumulative effect. One stop rarely changes a life. A pattern of stops can. And when those patterns fall disproportionately on the same communities, the outcome is not coincidence, but design. The consequences extend beyond the individual. Each encounter increases the likelihood of court involvement, fines, and records that limit employment, housing, and education. These barriers reinforce the inequalities already embedded in school funding, neighborhood investment, and political representation. The system feeds itself. The more contact a community has with enforcement, the more justification exists for continued scrutiny. This is not a failure of the law to work as intended. It is the law working precisely as structured. By focusing on behavior that is nearly universal but selectively enforced, the system creates a pipeline that feels lawful at every stage. No single step appears extreme. No explicit bias is required. And yet the destination remains strikingly consistent. Traffic stops become the quiet hinge between everyday life and institutional control. They are the moment where legal theory meets lived reality, where neutrality on paper translates into imbalance on the street. In this way, the roadside becomes another courtroom, another counting mechanism, another place where power is exercised without being openly declared. Seen in isolation, a traffic citation is forgettable. Seen as part of the larger pattern, it is essential. It connects representation, justice, and opportunity into a single continuous process. The law does not need to say who it is watching. It simply keeps stopping the same people, over and over, until the system's logic feels inevitable. After the traffic stop funnels people into the system, and the courtroom decides their fate, the consequences do not end with a sentence or a record. They follow people home, shaping where families live, what they own, and whether their communities can survive at all. This is where the story turns from movement and representation to something far more permanent. Land. Land has always been more than property. It is security, inheritance, leverage, and belonging. After emancipation, many black families acquired land against overwhelming odds, often without access to lawyers, banks, or formal legal guidance. Homes, farms, and small plots were passed down through generations by trust and tradition rather than paperwork. What looked like resilience on the surface concealed a vulnerability buried deep in the law. That vulnerability is known as heirs property. When land passes without a will, every descendant becomes a partial owner, each holding an undivided interest in the whole. No one owns a specific room, field, or acre. Everyone owns everything, and that is precisely the problem. Any single heir, even one who has never lived on the land, can force a legal action that puts the entire property at risk. Over time, outside buyers learn to exploit this. They search for distant relatives, purchase a fraction of ownership for a small sum, then use the courts to demand a sale of the entire property. The family does not lose the land because they failed to care for it or abandoned it. They lose it because the law treats shared ownership as an inconvenience to be resolved through sale rather than preservation. The process is presented as neutral, even fair. Property rights are property rights, the argument goes. But fairness assumes equal footing, and that footing was never equal to begin with. This mechanism fits seamlessly into the larger pattern already unfolding. Just as voting power is redistributed through technical counting rules, and justice is shaped through procedural discretion, land is transferred through legal pathways that never mention race but produce consistent results. Wealth flows out. Stability dissolves. Stability dissolves. Communities fragment. Zoning and environmental policy deepen the damage. Once land changes hands, its future is often decided by boards and agencies far removed from the people who once lived there. Industrial facilities, houses, highways, waste sites, and refineries are disproportionately placed near communities that have already been weakened by displacement and devaluation. Officials justify these decisions using market logic, cost efficiency, and planning necessity. The language is sterile. The impact is anything but. This did not begin in the present. Earlier systems openly directed environmental burdens towards certain neighborhoods while protecting others. When explicit segregation became unacceptable, the maps remained. The labels changed. Residential zones stayed residential. Industrial zones stayed industrial. And the communities forced to absorb pollution continued to do so, now under the cover of bureaucratic process rather than written exclusion. The effects accumulate slowly but relentlessly. Toxic exposure increases health risks. Health risks limit economic mobility. Limited mobility reduces political influence. Reduced influence makes it easier to place the next facility, approve the next zoning change, deny the next challenge. The cycle tightens, and the law, once again, stands at the center, insisting it is merely following procedure. What makes this especially powerful is how difficult it is to contest. To challenge these outcomes, families must navigate courts, appraisals, and regulatory systems designed for those with time, money, and expertise. The emotional value of land does not appear on balance sheets. History does not count as equity. And when land is lost, so is more than property. Access to loans disappears. Small businesses collapse. Political presence weakens. This connects directly back to everything that came before. Communities stripped of land are easier to over-police, easier to underfund, easier to overlook. Environmental harm becomes another quiet sentence imposed without a trial. No explicit hostility is required. The system simply moves forward, one transaction, one permit, one ruling at a time. In this way, land becomes the final ledger of inequality. It records the outcomes of representation lost, justice skewed, and mobility restricted. The law never announces its intent. It doesn't have to. The results speak with devastating clarity, etched into property lines, zoning maps, and landscapes transformed beyond recognition. As the story comes to a close, it becomes clear that the systems shaping everyday life rarely announce their intentions. They operate quietly, through code, budgets, and boundaries that appear neutral on the surface while producing outcomes that feel painfully familiar. Digital redlining decides which neighborhoods receive fast internet, reliable mobile coverage, or access to emerging technologies, not by race in name, but by profitability, data models, and risk scores that mirror old maps drawn decades ago. Opportunity now travels through fiber optic cables and algorithms, and when those pathways bypass certain zip codes, entire communities are left standing at the edge of the modern economy, watching doors close before they even appear. Healthcare follows the same pattern. Hospitals, specialists, and advanced treatment centers cluster where insurance reimbursement is strongest and property values are high, while underfunded clinics struggle to serve areas labeled as less viable. The result is not just longer wait times or fewer choices, but a steady erosion of health that compounds over generations. Chronic conditions go unmanaged, preventative care arrives too late, and life expectancy quietly diverges along geographic lines. No law needs to mention race for this to happen. The math does the work on its own, translating zip codes into outcomes that echo the past. Education completes the circle. When schools are funded primarily through property taxes, the quality of a child's education becomes tied to the assessed value of nearby homes rather than the potential of the students inside the classroom. District lines harden into invisible walls, separating well-resourced schools with modern facilities from those forced to operate with outdated materials and overcrowded rooms. Children grow up learning very different lessons about what the world expects from them, long before they are old enough to question why those differences exist. This is segregation rewritten in administrative language, enforced not by signs or speeches, but by spreadsheets and local ordinances. Together, these systems preserve the outcomes of Jim Crow while claiming the legitimacy of modern governance. They do not rely on open hostility or explicit exclusion, which makes them harder to challenge and easier to defend. Inequality becomes framed as coincidence, as the natural result of market forces or personal choices, rather than the predictable consequence of policy design. And because the mechanisms are dispersed across technology, healthcare, and education, no single moment feels like injustice, even as the cumulative effect shapes lives in profound ways. Yet understanding this pattern is not an exercise in despair. It is an invitation to clarity. When we recognize how the rules connect, how today's neutral language carries yesterday's weight, we gain the ability to ask better questions and demand more honest solutions. Change begins not only with new laws, but with a willingness to see the full story behind the data, the maps, and the budgets that quietly govern opportunity. Thank you for staying with this deep dive and for taking the time to listen. If this story helped you see familiar systems in a new light, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who care about understanding how history continues to shape the present. Your support helps keep these conversations alive, and together, we can keep digging deeper. And together, we can keep digging deeper. And together,